To vaccinate or not to vaccinate? That question is permeating communities, families, and doctors' offices across the country. So what are the questions that we have about vaccinations? Why is there a war about whether we should vaccinate our kids? And what does the medical community have to say about that? I'm joined tonight by Dr. Emily Beckett of Arkansas Children's Hospital to discuss those questions and more. All of that is coming up right here, right now. I'm Sam Chen, and this is Face the Issues. Good evening and welcome to Face the Issues. I'm Sam Chen. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. Vaccines and whether or not we should vaccinate our children. This question is permeating communities, families, and yes, the medical community. Why is it such a controversy? What vaccines are we talking about? And what is the impact of vaccinating and not vaccinating? I'm joined tonight by Dr. Emily Beckett, who serves in pediatrics at the University of Arkansas for Medical Services and works at the Arkansas Children's Hospital. That is a mouthful. Dr. Beckett, thank you for joining us. It is so good to see you. Welcome to the program.
Thank you so much for having me, Sam. I'm delighted to be here.
It is a pleasure. For our viewers who don't know, Emily and I go way back. We both were at Baylor University together, and it is a joy when you get to welcome some of your friends to your program as experts. And she certainly is that. Emily, to cover just some of your background, you have your Bachelor's of Science in Biology from Baylor University. You completed your Doctor of Osteopathic Medicine from the Texas College of Osteopathic Medicine, and you're currently serving in pediatrics at the University of Arkansas in Medical Services. Thank you again so much for joining us. Let's start with the basics. I mean, this is vaccinations. We see it on the news every day, almost. It seems in every community across the country, there's this debate about whether or not we should vaccinate. What are vaccines and what is the purpose of vaccinations? Let's just start there.
Sure. So vaccines are made from a very small amount of weak or dead germs like viruses or bacteria or toxins, and they help our body's immune system recognize that bacteria or virus. That way, when we're exposed, your immune system can fight that disease efficiently and help prevent you from getting sick.
Okay, so when we hear this a lot with the flu vaccine, right? So if someone is getting vaccinated, they're actually getting the dead virus injected into them?
Yeah, so the flu vaccine is a little bit tricky because we do use the year's previous most prevalent flu strains to make the following year's vaccine, but it is a denatured, meaning broken apart or dead portion of that virus. It's the protein portion so that your body's immune system can recognize that virus when it is possibly reintroduced in flu season. And then when your immune system is then introduced for that second time after the vaccine, it's able to mount a response and keep you from getting ill.
Understood. So what diseases then, I mean, the flu vaccine is the most common we hear about because we hear about it every year. But what diseases do we vaccinate against right now? And how effective are those vaccines?
So we have over 20 diseases that we currently vaccinate against. Chickenpox is a common one, diphtheria, tetanus, pertussis or whooping cough, measles, mumps, rubella, HPV, the human papillomavirus, meningococcal diseases, pneumococcal diseases, and then you can get into some kind of obscure, rabies, yellow fever, typhoid, things like that. There are many more. But vaccines are 85 to 95% efficacious when they're given on time. And I think that's another really crucial point to make, that they need to be given on a certain schedule to be most efficacious.
And why is that schedule so important?
That schedule is important because we start vaccinating against certain diseases at certain ages, because we know that if a child or baby that age were to contract that disease, it could potentially be fatal. And so we vaccinate against certain diseases at certain times because we know that those age groups are most at risk.
Understood. That makes sense. What diseases, and we hear this a lot about disease, you hear the CDC a lot of times say certain diseases have been eradicated, either in America or throughout the world. Is that done by vaccines? And what diseases have we seen eradicated?
So smallpox is the only disease that has been completely eradicated by vaccines. Polio could be next, and there's up to 80% of the world's children are now receiving the polio vaccine, and it has an 86% prevention rate. Now, in the U.S., measles was considered eradicated in 2000. Now, that is no longer the case anymore, but those are probably the big ones that we no longer really see.
Okay. And you mentioned the flu vaccine earlier, so I just want to come back to that real quick. The flu vaccine, my guess, again, I don't have any of the science in front of me, that's why you're on the show. My guess, at least from news reports, is that the flu vaccine is not 85% effective.
Correct.
And why is it that the flu vaccine is so hit or miss, but say the measles vaccine or the smallpox vaccine is so effective?
Sure. So the flu vaccine is more hit or miss because we are changing it depending on the year's previous strains. And while we would like to make it more effective in that way, it is still not nearly as effective as the vaccines for polio and measles. And because those vaccines, those viruses, they're not changing. But the flu virus has the ability to mutate every year and change. And so it's much more difficult to vaccinate against a virus that is smarter than our vaccine. But the other viruses and illnesses that are not prevalent anymore do not change. And so we were able to come up with a vaccine that effectively eradicates them.
That makes sense. Let's talk about the other side of the issue, which is increasingly, as you know, I don't have to tell you this, there is something called the anti-vax movement or the anti-vaxxer movement. And it's a movement across the country that suggests maybe we shouldn't vaccinate our kids, or at least we shouldn't make it mandatory. And this is driven by a study initially that claimed that certain vaccinations could lead to autism or other conditions. There seems to be a very human side to this argument, a fear of parents saying, it's not so much that I don't want my kid protected, but I'm afraid that, and we're weighing options. We're weighing between two very, very poor options. What do you see driving that fear and that concern? And is this something you see in your practice?
This is definitely something that I see in my practice. It's something that I encounter nearly every day that I have clinic.
Oh, wow.
And I think that there's a spectrum that parents kind of fall on. And I think there's a few really prevalent things that parents are scared of or have issues with, one of which is confidence. They either don't have confidence in the provider that they're talking to, or they just don't have confidence in the vaccine itself. I think there's another issue of complacency, not thinking that it's really necessary to vaccinate for one reason or another. And I think the issue of access is another really big issue. And I think, depending on which camp you fall in, my conversation is different.
Sure.
I have a lot of really great resources that I give parents, a few websites that I like to refer parents to, one of which is immunize.org. It has a lot of really great information that parents can go and just research on their own. A lot of parents, I would say a majority of families now have access to the internet and to Google. And while that can be very empowering, it can also be very crippling if you're not looking on the right website. And so I think having more confidence is a really big deal. And then complacency, I think that that's something that more and more parents are falling into that camp for one reason or another. And that's a lot harder of a conversation to have because I can't necessarily provide science isn't necessarily something that's going to change a complacency issue.
Sure.
So that's a little bit more challenging. But I think it just kind of depends where on that spectrum you fall. But there's definitely a spectrum of parents and families out there.
Sure. Is there a specific vaccine that they're afraid of, or is it just vaccines in general?
I think probably the measles, mumps, rubella vaccine is a big one just because of Dr. Wakefield's initial study back in 1998. And then I think
that's the one we call MMR, right?
Yes, the MMR vaccine, yes. So I think that one's a big one. I think also just the generalized fear that we're giving too many vaccines at once is something that I talk to parents a lot too. They're afraid of overwhelming their child's immune system. But we know that that's just not true. And the amount of components in the vaccines is so much more concentrated now that we're actually not giving a lot. We're giving just what they need. And we wouldn't recommend more than what's absolutely necessary.
Sure. You mentioned Dr. Wakefield. My next question, this fear didn't come out of nowhere, right? This wasn't let's just make up something that we're going to target today. Generally, when people do that, they target a celebrity or politics. Or there was a study, you mentioned Dr. Wakefield. Talk to us about that study. What happened to it? Where did this fear come from?
Sure. So Dr. Andrew Wakefield was a British physician, and he published a study that was published in The Lancet. It was a very prestigious medical journal back in 1998. And he claimed that there was a link between the MMR vaccine and autism. And once that hit Europe, it exploded. I mean, there was so much fear and hesitation. And in fact, it has taken nearly 20 years for the UK's rate of immunizations to recover from that study. Very, very tragic. Millions of children died because they weren't vaccinated. And Dr. Wakefield ended up getting his medical license revoked. He now lives in the United States, actually. He's no longer allowed to practice medicine. His co-authors actually retracted the paper and it was debunked. All of the information was actually falsified. His study didn't have enough numbers and it didn't have enough real data to support his findings.
Sure. And you said his co-authors retracted it.
Correct. It has been retracted.
Wow. That's the importance of knowing between correlation and causation, I suppose.
Absolutely.
Great information. Dr. Beckett, thank you. Don't go away. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Face the Issues. Dr. Beckett, thank you again for joining us. This is an incredibly important topic. I like to call these topics national topics that impact all of our communities. We're talking about vaccines. We're talking about the anti-vax movement, and you were talking about the study that was ultimately retracted, not just debunked, but retracted, that argued there was a link between the MMR vaccine and autism. There's a number of arguments. Different parents, to your point earlier, make different arguments about why they don't want their children vaccinated. I just want to run some of these by you, get your take as a medical professional. One of the ones is you hear a lot is parents believe that not vaccinating their children does not actually serve as a threat to anyone else's kids. And the argument is if the medical community says vaccines work and everyone else is vaccinated, then they can't contract the diseases. So if my kid's not vaccinated, that's okay. I don't know if you've heard that, but how do you respond to that?
Oh, yes, this is definitely something that we hear a lot. I think to answer this question, we need to talk about the concept of herd immunity. So herd immunity is a concept that when there's a community of people, a large number of people, and a majority of them are vaccinated, then the few people in that community who are not vaccinated are protected. Because when a majority of the community is protected against communicable diseases, then the risk of that community having someone fall ill to a disease is low because a majority of the people are vaccinated against said diseases. Now, when herd immunity fails us is when the majority of the community decides that they're already protected because of these other people. Now, if a majority of the community decides that they don't need to be protected and they choose not to vaccinate, well, now all of a sudden the majority of our community is not vaccinated, and there are more people not vaccinated than there are vaccinated. And so when a communicable disease is introduced into said community, now the risk is so great that a lot of people contract that disease, as evidenced by the measles outbreak. So my argument and kind of the information that I present to parents is that I think that it's very important to vaccinate your children because we need herd immunity to protect the very vulnerable population of children that cannot receive vaccines because they're suffering from another illness like cancer. There are a lot of diseases that kids already have that prevent them from even being able, not that their parents are choosing not to vaccinate, but that they truly cannot get vaccinated. And those children need to be the few people in our community that are not vaccinated. And we, the healthy population, need to be the majority of the community that are vaccinated. And I think it's very, very important because it is so impactful to see a child sick in the hospital from a disease that could have been prevented by a shot. And so it really breaks my heart when I see these kids suffering. And while no kid enjoys getting a shot, I think they are able to recover much more quickly from a shot than they are some of these diseases that we have to treat them for.
Sure, that makes sense. One of the other things that we hear, not as much, but we still hear a lot, you've got some well-known figures who do this, including the governor of Kentucky, Matt Bevin, recently stated that he did this. They're engaging in advocating these things called pox parties. And I'm guessing here the idea is that they believe that it is more effective if someone has contracted the pox, the chicken pox, to bring all the other children over to their house to have a party and somehow expose them to the chicken pox. And the argument is that this is a more effective way than vaccines to expose our children to the disease and ultimately build their immunity. True or false?
True and false.
Okay.
So it is true that when you contract a disease, the immune response that your body creates is strong, is very strong. Sometimes stronger than the immune response that your body creates when you receive a vaccine. Now, the flip side of that is when you expose a large group of children to chickenpox, one, you're not only infecting them with the disease versus just giving them a shot, you're infecting them. And so they are now incredibly uncomfortable. They're itching all the time. They have fever. They don't feel good. And there are some really adverse effects of getting the chickenpox: permanent scarring, skin infections that require antibiotics and hospitalizations, pneumonia, which is actually the #1 cause of death in kids with chickenpox. And so pox parties, I would never, and I don't think any pediatrician would really advocate for pox parties, because we can prevent chickenpox with a vaccine, and the immune response that you mount is enough to prevent getting that vaccine. You do not need to expose your child and have them fall ill to the chickenpox in order to prevent them from getting chickenpox in the future.
Sure, that again makes sense, but this is one of the things that just keep coming up. These ideas of pox parties. Let me ask you this. There are those who are arguing that homeopathic routes, so not necessarily pox parties, but different things that grandma taught, or just different medical remedies that were kind of passed down through the generations, that these different homeopathic routes are more effective than vaccines in preventing diseases. Go ahead.
No. So this is something that we encounter as well. And vaccines are promoted by the CDC and the American Academy of Pediatrics, the AAP, because they are safe and efficacious. And if there were alternatives, then pediatricians would not advocate so strongly for kids to get vaccinated. We know that vaccines can prevent diseases, and that's why we advocate for them. And we do not support other homeopathic remedies because there isn't really science or data to support that they are anywhere as efficacious as vaccines are.
And I want to ask a little bit as we close out here about, you've really helped us understand what vaccines are, and also specifically some of the I think the larger concerns and fears that drive parents who are concerned about vaccines. But I want to close out talking about the impact of what happens if we don't vaccinate. There's a report recently that came out that you mentioned earlier that we virtually eradicated measles in the United States about 20 years ago until now. And there are now more measles cases in the United States than we've seen in decades. What is the community and national impact if we don't vaccinate our children?
Well, I think ultimately our community will see a lot more deaths from preventable diseases. We've already seen measles outbreaks in multiple parts of the country. And while the majority of measles cases you present with a rash and some cough and congestion and runny nose, over 1 million children die from the measles. And so ultimately, I think what we risk by not vaccinating our children is death. And that seems very extreme, and I definitely understand that. But ultimately, that's what we're risking. We're risking losing a population to things that we can prevent.
You said that you have parents who don't want to vaccinate. What do you say if we have viewers watching this tonight and they say, I get it, I get what the medical stuff says, but I still have concerns, or it won't happen to my kid. My kid's strong, they'll survive if they get measles. What do you say to a parent who still has doubts?
You know, I hear you. I hear your doubts, and I understand that no parent wants to inflict any sort of pain on their child. But I would encourage you to do some research on some reputable websites. I mentioned immunize.org is a great website. There's another one, vaccines.gov is another really great website. And then healthychildren.org. All three of those are very reputable. They provide very sound data and information that you can read for yourself about numerous studies that have been performed and see the science behind why we advocate for vaccines. I would encourage parents to talk to their pediatrician and talk to your community members. At this point, depending on where you live in the U.S., you either know someone or have a neighbor that's been affected by measles. And I would just talk to them about the impact that that's had on their family, financially and emotionally, and, you know, the impact that it's had on their child as well.
That's great advice. Dr. Beckett, thank you so much for taking the time. Don't go away. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Face the Issues. My thanks to Dr. Emily Beckett for spending this half hour with us talking about the incredibly important topic of vaccines and the impact that they have and not vaccinating has on both our children and our community. Dr. Beckett, thank you again. I want to close out. We always like to close out having a little bit of fun, getting to know our guests. You are a doctor, and I've known you quite a while. This has been a lifelong dream for you. And there are a lot of young people, especially young girls, who will watch this program and say, I want to be the next Dr. Emily Beckett. What advice do you give to young people, especially young women who want to pursue medicine and become a doctor just like you?
Well, follow your heart and keep pursuing your dreams. I think that if medicine is something that you're truly passionate about, then you need to know that it is definitely a long journey. It requires a lot of late nights. It requires a lot of sacrifice, but ultimately it is incredibly rewarding, and I would not want to do anything else. I think that it's a field that is constantly evolving, and so it makes it very dynamic and fun. But it's a field that's also really challenging. And so if you're up for the challenge and you're willing to put in the hard work, then I think that you're perfect.
For you, what's the best part of being a doctor?
The best part of being a doctor, I think, is getting to be part of people's lives that I wouldn't normally encounter. I get to deal with families who are incredibly vulnerable, especially in pediatrics because they have a sick child. And being able to be part of that very memorable portion of their life, whether for better or for worse, I think is powerful. And I really feel blessed to be able to be part of that portion and that journey for people.
Emily, your journey itself to being a doctor, I mean, you said it earlier, which is a very long journey and it's not always easy and there's long nights. I remember you telling me that you were working overnight shifts over Easter weekend. What advice do you give to someone who might be in that right now, or is pre-med or in medical school pursuing that, and it's just tough? What advice do you give to them?
It is so tough. My advice would be to find a community of people around you that are understanding, but also encouraging and supportive, because you're going to need people to fall back on, and you're going to need people to remind you that this is something that you wanted, and this is something that you've been working for, and to not give up and to persevere, because the end is worth it. It is so worth it.
That's awesome. Dr. Beckett, thank you so much for taking the time. You are a role model and an example. It's a pleasure having you on the program. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here.
An honor is all ours. And that is all the time we have tonight. So thank you so much for tuning in and continue this conversation online. Just use the hashtag #FaceTheIssues. Join me again next week as we unpack another issue. My name is Sam Chen. On behalf of all of us here at Face the Issues, thank you and good night.